Jesus' teachings holds a lot in common with the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Scriptures. He talks about the practicalities of life, about how to forgive your neighbor, about how to be generous, about how not to be anxious. And similar to the wisdom literature, he uses illustrations and stories, particularly drawn from common everyday life, to show that God's presence exists in the small things, in the everyday things. Jesus parallels the themes and the issues raised in the wisdom literature as sort of a fulfillment of them. But remember that Jesus is never presented as just another wise teacher. He's not another King Solomon. He's something very different than that. And this is where the Christian scriptures depart from the Hebrew scriptures, and the New Testament says something very different about wisdom than the Hebrew scriptures do. The New Testament makes a claim about Jesus that takes us far beyond the idea that he was simply another Jewish wisdom teacher. He doesn't just teach wisdom. He is the wisdom of God. And that is an extraordinary claim, as it sounds. And to understand it, we have to look at the wisdom tradition and how Jesus departs from it. Remember that in Proverbs 8, wisdom is personified as a figure who speaks about her relationship with God and with creation. Wisdom says that she was present when God established the heavens and set the foundations of the earth. She was, quote, beside him as creation took shape. Now we need to be careful here. Proverbs 8 is poetry, and we should not read it as secretly a prophecy written to be included in the New Testament centuries before Jesus. The author of Proverbs is personifying divine wisdom in order to communicate something about God's created order. Nevertheless, later Jewish writings developed this theme further, and wisdom increasingly came to be associated with God's presence and God's created activity and God's revelation to humanity. If you look at the wisdom literature of the Second Temple period, for instance, outside the canon of Scripture, you have the book of Sirach. And it speaks extensively about wisdom and identifies wisdom with God's revelation to Israel. Wisdom becomes associated with God's self-disclosure and with the life of God's people. The wisdom of Solomon goes even further. It describes wisdom in language that is strikingly exalted. Wisdom is associated with God's glory and God's eternal light and God's creative activity. The author describes wisdom as, quote, a breath of the power of God, and, quote, a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. These texts demonstrate that by the time of Jesus, Jewish thinkers had already developed a rich theological vocabulary for speaking about divine wisdom, and the New Testament authors inherited that vocabulary. So that background then lays the groundwork for understanding one of the most important passages in the New Testament, the opening of John's Gospel. It says, in the beginning was the Word. And the Greek word that is translated word here in English is logos. God doesn't begin his gospel with Jesus' birth the way Matthew and Luke do. He begins actually before creation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The logos was with God. This language is deliberately reminiscent of Genesis, as has been widely observed. In the beginning takes us back to the opening words of the Bible, where it says that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But John seems to be drawing upon the Jewish wisdom tradition. The Word is with God. The Word is involved in creation and brings life and light and reveals God. John then makes a sort of a bold claim. The Word became flesh and lived among us. Whatever else John intends by this language, he is making a claim about divine revelation. The God who created the world has made himself known within the world. The divine Word, through whom creation came into being, has entered human history. So for Christians, this is the point at which the wisdom tradition sort of reaches its climax. The wisdom that Israel has sought is no longer simply something to be learned. It's become personal. The wisdom that we saw in Proverbs now appears in the Gospels as a human being who walks around on the ground of Galilee and stubs his toes and eats fish and teaches in the synagogues in the villages, sits at tables with sinners and touches lepers. He goes around telling stories and crying at funerals and confronting religious hypocrites. Ultimately, he goes to the cross. And that last point is, of course, central to the Christian claim about Jesus as the wisdom of God. It cannot be separated from the cross. As Paul will later write in Corinthians, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. And then a few verses later, he describes the message of the cross as foolishness to those who are perishing. So how can the cross be wisdom? From the perspective of conventional human wisdom, crucifixion looks like defeat. Jesus lost to the Romans. The powerful overcame the powerless, and the religious authorities have silenced the troublesome teacher. The Roman state can execute whoever comes against it, and Jesus proved no exception. So if wisdom means avoiding suffering and preserving your reputation and living a good, successful life, the cross is the opposite. But Paul deliberately turns that assumption upside down. The cross reveals God's wisdom, and that it operates according to a different logic than ours. Human beings often understand power as the ability to control others, but God reveals power through self-giving, sacrificial love. Human beings can understand greatness as superiority. That was certainly the nature of the Roman Empire. But Jesus reveals greatness in servanthood. We may look for the most intelligent and the most educated to be the most wise, but the Christian gospel shows that wisdom communicates as faithful love even through the poor and the marginalized. Paul is exposing the limits of a particular conception of wisdom that was built up in the book of Proverbs, but which is changed dramatically in the stories of the life of Jesus. There's a profound connection to Job nonetheless here. Remember, Job wants God to explain himself because Job has lived a righteous life and has lost everything and his life is a disaster, and he wants an account of the universe that will make his suffering intelligible. And when God speaks, he doesn't reveal an answer, he simply reveals himself, and that he is larger than Job's understanding, and that the universe belongs to God and not to Job or to us. The Christian answer to suffering is God's presence in the midst of suffering, and that's what the cross is. This is one reason the Christian understanding of Christ as wisdom is so powerful. It's God's presence in suffering. The wisdom literature taught us that human beings cannot comprehend the whole of God's purposes, and certainly Job makes that exceedingly clear. Ecclesiastes talks about just enjoying what you can in life because you'll never understand the whole thing. And even as Proverbs seeks to spell out some sort of an algorithm for living righteously and being rewarded, all of that crashes into the New Testament and this surprising wisdom that exceeds our understanding. This is why the language of incarnation matters. The Word became flesh. That tells us that belief in the eternal Son of God and that he assumed human nature and entered human history. The human search for wisdom, according to the Christian, leads to a person. And that helps us understand why the early Christians put such extraordinary emphasis upon following Jesus. If he were simply a wise teacher, you could admire him and learn from him, maybe borrow some of his teachings and apply them to your life. But if Jesus is wisdom incarnate, then the appropriate response is more radical. This is why we are called disciples and not merely students. A disciple learns to live as the teacher lives. The central concern of Israel's wisdom literature is actually the formation of character. Proverbs wants to form wise people, and in the same way, Jesus forms disciples. The wisdom tradition taught that human beings become wise through repeated practices of paying attention and being disciplined, and living humbly and pursuing justice and being reverent. Jesus takes all of that up and places that at the center of his teachings in a simple command, come follow me. It's actually easy to say, but it's remarkably demanding because it demands our whole lives. This is wisdom as imitation. Watch how Jesus lives. Observe how he prays. Repeat his words. See how he responds to suffering. Notice how he treats people who have little social status. Observe what he does with power. Watch how he responds to his enemies. Notice the way he receives children and outsiders. Look at how he confronts hypocrisy and then forgives those who hurt him. What would it mean for those qualities to become characteristic of our own lives? The Apostle Paul eventually expresses the same idea when he tells Christians to have the mind of Christ. Christian wisdom is the gradual formation of a mind and character patterned after Jesus. This is why the Sermon on the Mount is so demanding. Jesus tells his disciples to forgive, and he tells them to be generous and to love their enemies and to pray. This is where the distinction between information and wisdom is so clear. You can memorize the Sermon on the Mount and remain unchanged. But wisdom begins when teaching enters our lives, when the Sermon on the Mount begins to shape who we are and what we do. One of the most distinctive features of the New Testament presentation of Jesus is this. The sages point beyond themselves, but Jesus points at himself. Proverbs says, go get wisdom, and Jesus says, come follow me. The sages teach that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And Jesus teaches his disciples to know God through him. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life. This is why the New Testament's wisdom theology cannot be reduced to the idea that Jesus was exceptionally intelligent. That claim is ontological as well as ethical, a philosopher would say. Christians came to believe that the one who teaches divine wisdom shares in the identity and life of God, and thus obligates our behavior. The Gospel of John makes this explicit through his use of the language of the Word. Paul does something similar in Colossians, where Christ is described as the one through whom all things were created, and in whom, quote, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Creation and redemption, therefore, become connected. The wisdom through whom the world was made is the wisdom through whom the world is being renewed. Now, this is a great claim among Christian theology, because the same divine wisdom that ordered creation in the first place is now working to restore it back to something like its original order. This gives Christian theology a way of holding together the themes encountered through the wisdom literature. Creation is good, but creation is wounded. Human beings are capable of wisdom, but human wisdom is limited. Suffering is real, but suffering does not have the final word. The resurrection then becomes the final decisive Christian answer to Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes looks at mortality and says, eat, drink, and be merry, we're going to die. You're never going to understand it all. Every human achievement goes to waste. And then Christianity replies, yes, but death itself will be defeated. God has entered death and emerged from it. The wisdom of God, therefore, leads through the cross to the resurrection. This means that Christians believe the ultimate destination of creation is renewal. So now you can see why the wisdom literature is still so important for Christian theology. A lot of people in churches today read the New Testament or read the stories of Jesus and never venture back into the wisdom literature. And when they get there, they find it to be just sort of odd old sayings that don't necessarily relate to the story of salvation that they've learned through the New Testament. But you see now, the wisdom literature sets a preface to what is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus being declared the wisdom of God. He is the thing that shapes our character and our identity the way the wisdom literature says that wisdom should. So we're left with the question, what does it mean to live wisely? The ancient sages of Israel point towards reverence and humility and righteousness and faithfulness. Pay attention to creation and the order that God has created and seek justice within it. Live with humility before the mystery. Realize that there are some exceptions to the algorithm, and like Job, we can go through suffering that remains unexplained and unaccounted for. But then look at Jesus. Wisdom embodied. Here is the truly wise human being, the one who knows the Father perfectly and yet kneels and washes his disciples' feet. He possesses all divine authority, and yet he doesn't turn away children. Here is the one who enters death and emerges victorious. The Christian claim is that Jesus is wisdom made visible. And so our question can only then be, what kind of person are we becoming as we follow after Jesus? That may be the most appropriate question we can ask as we round out our studies of the wisdom literature. How do I live with gratitude? How do I live with reverence? What does it look like for me to be humble, even in the midst of suffering, even in the presence of my enemies? What does Jesus do to my heart and my character as I go through the simple practicalities of this life, the ups and downs of this life? The wisdom literature asks us to become wise, and the Christian tradition makes a stronger claim: seek the wisdom that is revealed in Jesus and live in it by imitating him. That's perhaps the most appropriate place for a course on the Jewish wisdom literature to come to a close. Wisdom is something we pursue and practice, and ultimately for Christians encounter in Jesus Christ. God bless your ongoing studies of the wisdom literature.